I'm also Director of Research at the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, and we have produced this publication, and this is about how you direct a company that is not listed, and it takes you through, this is for family-owned businesses, and it tells you the sorts of things you need to think about if you are a family-owned business. You can get this on the Institute's website and download it. And what it basically does, it says, first of all, what is your risk appetite? Are you, a go-getting sort of company, or are you, you just like to carry on with sort of, average sort of growth and whatever? But what you need to do, even in a small family company, it's worth spending 5 minutes thinking about what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are your opportunities, and what are your threats. 5 minutes, that's all it takes. Do you know, as a company, what they are? Do you know what they are in your company? All it does takes 5 minutes. Quickly write it down on a bit of paper. Think about strategy, business continuity. We heard this morning about, what about your succession planning? Who is going to take over? What's going to happen if you have a fire that wipes out all your premises and your manufacturing plant and whatever? So think about what you're going to do and have some contingency planning. Think about operational risks like fraud and like, what is the human resource risk, the people you're employing. What about financial risks? How about money laundering, bribery? Now, we know bribery in some certain parts of the world is really bad. So I've just come back from Nigeria before I came here, and I know bribery is rife in Nigeria. What about regulatory? Are you compliance? What about health and safety on your environmental risk? And what about political risk? And that doesn't mean political risk as in the government. It just means, what communication do you have with people within the organisation? What communication do you have with people external to the organisation? They could be your customers or your suppliers or regulatory bodies or whatever. And what about making outside appointments to the organisation? So this leads us on to control. Now, I've done some studies looking at some of the collapses of the banks. And every time you see a collapse of a bank, well, what actually happens is people are able to sidestep controls, they breach limits, they do things that they are not meant to do. And so there are structures in place where people might be all-powerful. So if we think of Nick Leeson at Barings Bank, he had some polite Japanese, Chinese women working for him, and they weren't going to say no to this white man that had come in, and he was on the trading floor, but he was also a back office guy, and these polite women were not going to say, oh no, we won't do that. So there was no control over Nick Leeson. And do you know whether you've got that situation happening in your companies? If you have a family member in a key position, is that family member overriding any controls that might have been instigated in your organisations? What about also looking at when you look at the policies and internal controls of an organisation, that should be the remit of the audit committee. But we've just heard that hardly any companies here have an audit committee. So where is the remit of making sure you have an internal control system? Who is responsible for it? Do you actually have one in your organisation? Do you know what it is? You need controls over all your different systems. You need audit trails of your systems. You need controls over all the different sorts of transactions that you're going to do. And at the end of the day, you've got to take into account the culture of the organisation. So don't implement controls for a big US listed company. They're probably not appropriate. But you do need to implement controls that are going to be relevant to your company, in your culture and in your situation. Now, these are really some of the key points that any organisation should have. Segregation of duties is probably the most fundamental control that an organisation should have. You need manuals, you need transaction limits, you need to know about, well, what happens if all your IT systems fall down. You need people reconciling things, approving things, and so on. So there's a checklist there of things that all companies should think about, whether they're small family-owned or whether they're big organisations. What about internal control? Internal control, where they're weak, that's why companies suffer fraud. Most fraud is never ever reported. Most fraud is caused and done by people internal to the organisation. It's not people stealing outside like customers from a shop. It's done internally by people who work in the organisation, and they spot where they can make some money by the system isn't working right, and so they can make some money from fraud. And if you think about the US, it has the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and Section 404 for accountants was an extremely bad one because it created a lot of work. But PwC, a Big Four firm, reported they looked at 717 companies, listed US companies, and they found that over 10% of them did not have satisfactory controls. And these are big US listed companies. So what about your companies? Let's have a look now at transparency and openness and disclosure. Disclosure is key. If you disclose things, you have transparency, and the more you have transparency, the more external stakeholders and internal stakeholders can engage with you. Now, in the UK, in Europe, we introduced international financial reporting standards in 2005. So myself and some colleagues, we got together and we did a report on how difficult or how easy they were to implement these standards in European companies in 3 countries. And we've produced this. This is another Institute of Chartered Accountants report. And basically, certain standards caused a lot of headaches for some companies, notably IAS 39, which is all about financial instruments. So the derivatives that companies might do, and lots of companies might be hedging, for example, their foreign exchange rate risk. So I expect a lot of Andean region companies are hedging their foreign exchange exposures if they have lots of imports or exports. So it affects anyone like that. They will have to do IAS 39. Oh, did I finish that one? Right. Oh, anyway, yes, carry on. What about enforcement? Every country has lots of enforcement agencies. But at the end of the day, who regulates the regulators? And who is making sure that the regulators are doing what the regulators should be doing? So there's no good having regulators if the regulators aren't effective, and if people think that, oh, I'll never get caught because the regulators aren't really doing what they should be doing. So, and again, that's not just in this part of the world, that is a global problem of enforcement and regulation of the regulators. What about auditors? I was an auditor for 6 years working for Ernst & Young in London, and we have to make judgments. But what training do people have to enable them to make judgments? Okay, I know technical accounting and I know all the rules, but can I make a judgment? Am I good at decision making? And maybe a lot of countries don't spend enough time on training business people on making judgments and having enough knowledge to be able to make those judgments. I mentioned earlier in the Columbia you have to rotate your auditors. Now, we've had lots of arguments and debate in Europe about whether you should rotate auditors. Now, the first year of doing an audit is the highest risk that you can have. You take over a new audit, you don't know the systems, you don't know the controls, so it's very, very difficult. So